On behalf of Namita Gokhale, William Dalrymple, and all my colleagues at Teamwork Arts, welcome back to a new season of JLF's Brave New World, beamed for the first time since the lockdown straight from Diggi Palace in Jaipur, from where the festival originated 13 years ago. We really take this occasion to thank the Diggi family for their continued support to the festival, and it's absolutely delightful to be back here for the first time since the lockdown. Our magazine partner for the series is The Week, Journalism with a Human Touch. Our session today, Raya, Krishnadevaraya of Vijayanagara, Srinivas Reddy in conversation with Manu S. Pillai. Srinivas Reddy's Raya Krishnadevaraya of Vijayanagara is a vivid and compelling account of one of the most dynamic and illustrious rulers of the Indian subcontinent. Krishnadevaraya was known not only for his political expansion through the Deccan, but also for the cultural dynamism and the nurturing of ancient texts and traditions. Reddy is a translator, musician, and academic who has also translated Krishnadevaraya's Amukta and Kalidasa's Meghadutam. In conversation with author Manu Pillai, he examines the splendor of Krishnadevaraya's rule and its impact on the region. Srinivas Reddy is a scholar, translator, and musician. He studied classical South Asian languages and literature at UC Berkeley and currently teaches at Brown University and IIT Gandhinagar, India. Reddy is also a concert sitarist and spends his time performing, teaching, and conducting research around the world. Manu S. Pillai is the author of the critically acclaimed The Ivory Throne, Rebel Sultans and the Courtesan, The Mahatma and the Italian Brahmin. His other essays on history have appeared in Mint Lounge, The Hindu, Hindustan Times, Open Magazine, New Statesman, and other publications. Remember, all our sessions that have been available for broadcast are now, you can catch them on Facebook page JLF Litfest and on our YouTube channel Jaipur Litfest JLF, including the series from JLF North America, as well as Voices of Faith. Please do remember to ask questions and comment by typing it into the comment section below. Ladies and gentlemen, Raya, Krishnadevaraya of Vijayanagara, Srinivas Reddy in conversation with Manu Pillai. Manu, Srinivas, over to you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sanjay. Srinivas, we've only got about 45 minutes, so I'm not going to go into a very long preamble about the book, except that I thoroughly enjoyed the book when it came out a year and a half ago now. I can't believe time has really gone by very quickly. And it's one of those books which I first read in a single sitting because it was simply so interesting to read a biography of Krishnadevaraya, because you don't have anything in that space. And then, of course, periodically went back to make notes and dog-ear pages and keep referring to the book. But your own journey with Krishnadevaraya or Krishnaraya has been fairly long, because well before you published this book last year, I remember reading your PhD thesis, which is a magnificent piece of work, your analysis of his writing, of his kingship and so on. And then, of course, you've also done the translation of the Amukta. Tell us a little bit about this long relationship you've had with Krishnaraya.
Thank you, Manu, and thank you everyone for inviting me. But I guess you must have read the book early, because it only came out, at the end of March. So it hasn't been that long. I guess a lot has happened since all of that. I mean, the book was released on the day of the lockdown. So that gives some perspective on how much has happened since, it got released and what we've all dealt with in our lives and in the world. But in regard to my relationship with Raya, and the main thing is when you read someone's work, I mean, whether it be a historical account or a academic book or anything, but more so I think even with poetry, when you read someone's literature, I think that's a really deep window into somebody's psyche and persona and worldview. And in that sense, I felt, when you really get into reading that work, verse after verse, which, I did for my thesis, you get to a feeling of a certain intimacy with someone. You feel like you know them. And then when Shivapriya asked me, she said, you should write a biography, and you'd be the right person to do this. And it was always something I kind of wanted to do. Like you said, like the thesis had a lot of other stuff that was not in just the translation that Penguin did. So drawing on that stuff and putting it all together, it was like a natural extension of things that I'd been thinking about. So the main thing is feeling that kind of closeness and intimacy by reading someone's work in a very deep and detailed way.
And did you have any hesitation at all about biography as a format? Because, for example, a lot of academics I know tend to frown upon biography as a style or as a means of communicating history. Did that ever sort of play on your mind, and you thought that
not at all? No, yeah. I mean, yeah, not at all. I don't even know why academics feel that way. I think biography is a great, wonderful way actually to look at history and, a time period or even thematic things. Because again, you're getting of course it's one person's perspective, but it's a deep perspective. And, that kind of depth of analysis, I think in one thing can really reveal a lot of, broader general trends and whatnot. So.
And how many years has it been since you've been working on Raya now? Your PhD thesis was published, I think, 2012? Or was it before
10.
that? 10.
Yeah, 10 or 9. I mean, the thing is, I took time off from grad school when I kind of got frustrated with academia. And then that's when, again, Shivapriya, when she was at Penguin, my editor, she just contacted me and said, would you like to work on, or have you found a publisher for this work? And I hadn't even really done a lot of translating yet. And so I rushed and I did some translations and I sent it to her, and she said, oh, these are great. And then I was touring that for 2 years, music-wise, and I wasn't in school. But while I was touring, I translated all of Amuktamalya, and so the book came out before my thesis. And then, my advisors and everyone was like, you really should come back and get your PhD. So I did, and that's what happened. So, I mean, I'd been working on it for a while, but then after the thesis, I kind of stopped working on Vijayanagara stuff. I was teaching and doing other things, and I was, various other areas of interest. And then I did the Kalidasa books in between. And then it was good to kind of go back to Raya after some gap too, and revisit things, because you get a kind of a fresh perspective. So that was nice.
Yeah, in fact, your very strong base in his own writing, in fact, in the literary sources, is one of the things that makes the book very interesting, because there isn't much, for example, in comparison to the Mughals, there isn't much on this particularly fascinating emperor in the south. But the sources that you do have, a lot of it, which is literary in nature, you do sort of cull those very well. We'll come back to that. Just the story of the man himself. Now, one of the things that I found really refreshing reading this is how easily it communicates in many ways that a lot of the notions we have about Indian kingship, a lot of it is just fiction in a way. These linear narratives we build. The idea that one king is succeeded by his eldest son and then his eldest son, all of those things go out the window. Notions about caste, for example. Now, Krishnadevaraya, one constant theme throughout the book, at least the way I read it, was that you always see there is a slight caste problem. There is the problem of pedigree. He doesn't come from one of these, self-proclaimed Kshatriya families. There's always that slightly unorthodox origin to this king. And it's interesting because it tells you a lot about Indian kingship in general, because a lot of other kings were illegitimate. A lot of other kings came from backgrounds that were not necessarily the most exalted. So if you can just tell us about his early years, that so-called controversial story about his mother, the roots of the family, etc., and how then he sort of comes into power.
Well, I mean, even how we're talking about it right now is still positioning ourselves against some kind of perceived understanding of how kings should be, right? So even like making it a big deal that like we have to explain now that this is actually how most kings were. What we should just be saying is this is quite normal, and there's nothing actually new or interesting about this. It's just that we've been given this perceived notion about how kings are and how they should be, not only from traditional kind of sources, but also the historiography that's been building up since colonial times. And so I mean, I had to address that issue, but I didn't want to make it a huge thing always. You know, and a lot of, we don't know. The bottom line is we don't really know the exact details of his birth. There is a legend about, you know, his father, who was also not of Kshatriya origin to begin with. But he did apparently, you know, by some magical circumstances, you know, sleep with a dasi that was in the court at that time, and so he's always known as a dasi putra. But again, all of this, these are again, we have to see these stories too as like evolving out of a type of counter narrative to those structures of power that were also in place at that time. And again, the fact that we're talking about him now is in a way, again, reifying the idea that, you know, kings need to be kshatriyas or this thing or that. And as you well know, and so many people, if you actually just look at history, it's simply not the case whatsoever. So yeah, I don't know what to say except that Raya, and this is why I think biography is also a good, you know, yes, he's an exemplary kind of person, or, you know, beyond, he's extraordinary, but he's also exemplary in the sense that he's a good example of the types of kings that were around at this time. I mean, all of Vijayanagara is, their whole kingship is non-kshatriya. So the whole context of it has to be understood properly. And once that happens, then we don't need to even worry about these kinds of issues. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, which is why I often feel that, you know, there isn't enough of an emphasis on South India in the general narrative, because it does challenge a lot of these notions that we have from our so-called traditional views of kingship, etc. Because even the Nayakas, again, there's that whole warrior ethos, this whole Shudra idea over there. Vijayanagara establishes the new imperial standard. It doesn't matter that the kings were not classical Kshatriyas or whatever. They become the big thing. The Keladi Nayakas draw their legitimacy from it. These guys draw it, and then onwards into Ramnad and all kinds of other places.
But wouldn't you say that this is also indicative of things in the north too?
No,
why make a north-south distinction here?
No, I think the north, because in the same period, because so much is dominated by the Mughals, the caste angle doesn't necessarily come up. And where the Rajputs do come up, of course, there is, you know, there are discussions on Rajput identity as well, and how it moves from
Marathas
thing towards, No, but I mean, the whole idea is Krishnadevaraya does illustrate, you know, this principle very well. And throughout the book, while you do touch on it, that's one of the things. I did a review in the Hindu, and I think I wrote it in that there is no sermonizing on these things. You sort of touch on it, make your point, and then move on. There's no lingering on these things. But you know, the caste thing I raise also because a lot of this, especially because of the colonial approach to history and to this empire, a lot of this has always pivoted Vijayanagara against the Deccan Sultanates. It's been that whole idea of the Hindu-Muslim. And one of the other interesting angles that you bring in is this Dasiputra angle and Krishnadevaraya's conflict with the Gajapati in Orissa, and how there you find the Gajapati's sort of lofty, I'm a Kshatriya standard versus Krishnadevaraya. Gajapati seems to be a writer, or at least has a ghostwriter in Sanskrit. Krishnadevaraya seems to produce magnificent literature in the vernacular, in Telugu. And there's an interesting dynamic there, which again isn't something we generally talk about. If you can just tell us a little bit about that whole Vijayanagara Orissa and Vijayanagara Bahmani / successor states relationship.
Yeah, I mean that's a point I wanted to make that larger you know, kind of setting of contextualizing all this in a much more complex environment than we generally view it. So yeah, the standard thing is always Vijayanagara, the great bastion of, you know, Hindu empire against the onslaught of Islam. So that's the main axiom that you get from, you know, Sewell onwards. What we see when we look at the history, though, is that Raya, himself, of course, there was some antagonism with the sultans, no problem, but there as just any other enemy. But the most like tension that he had throughout his life, the longest battles he fought, the most kind of like acrimonious relationship he had with an enemy was with this Hindu king, was it Gajapati. And again, they claim Surya Vamshi lineage, although we're not sure about that either. I think who was Anirudh was telling me that that's not the case. I don't know. I mean, it's hard to know the lineages of all these guys too. Certainly that is the tradition that we get, certainly in the Telugu side, that, you know, the Gajapati lorded over him this fact that he was some great king and that Krishnadevaraya was just a Dasiputra. And so, and you find this a lot in history, that you have more tension with the people that are closer to you than you do with like your bigger enemies outside, you know? Yeah. And that theme I wanted to highlight to give a good, you know, counterbalance to this theme that, you know, Vijayanagara was just, fighting the sultans all the time, and it was a Hindu-Muslim thing. It wasn't. Everyone was an enemy. There were, and you know, you read your book, it's the same thing. You plenty of examples, you know, of Sultan Vijayanagara alliances, marriages that happened between them, etc., etc. So we really, I just feel like we need to embrace the richness of all of this diversity and complexity, and use that to help us today when we have the same kinds of complexities and you know, simple narratives that need to be not complexified, but you know, we need to kind of break those down a little and yeah.
Talk about them. And since you mentioned identity, you know, that's the other thing with language, right? You have a line, not in the book, maybe from the thesis, which I've written down here, where you refer to how this is in the context of the Amuktamalya, which was written by Krishnadevaraya. And you talk about how this is a king of Karnataka writing in Telugu about a Tamil saint. I'm very curious as to your idea of whether there was a regional construct that was coming along, whether there was an identity being built around language very clearly, because we see it in parts of Maharashtra emerging, we see it in Karnataka emerging, whether Krishnadevaraya was trying to either surpass that and construct something larger, or whether he was simply sort of highlighting the courtly prestige that Telugu was acquiring in the same period. Even the language issue is linked to identity. It's linked to something bigger that's happening, you know, almost consciously. If you can just tell us something about this whole concept of a Karnataka king writing in Telugu about a Tamil saint and what that's all about.
Yeah, I mean, this is a complex issue. I mean, this is what I address in my thesis. So if anyone wants to read that, we can get into it. But I think this is where Raya is really kind of unique, because yes, there was, you know, this is a period of the rise of vernacular literatures, which really begins in the South, which you have to think about why that is, as opposed to, you know, you don't get like a flourishing of you know, Gujarati literature until later, you know, whereas Kannada, Telugu, they're much earlier, like around 1000. And of course, Tamil is a totally different case, because Tamil had a long-standing independent literary tradition going on for almost from, you know, the beginning of, you know, 200, let's say, or 0, let's say, for almost 2 millennia. So what I'm saying is there was this rise of vernacular traditions. By the time you get to Raya, Telugu regional literature had now gotten to the point where it was, you know, what they say is the golden age. It had reached an apex. It had reached a certain kind of independence of its own that was not solely dependent on Sanskrit texts or Sanskrit prototypes. At the same time, people were still writing stuff that was fairly, you know, based in Puranic stuff and fairly following most, you know, Sanskrit mythological themes. And that's why Raya is interesting, because this is the first time that he goes to look at a Tamil tradition. I mean, he's looking at the Alvars. So, and this is an interest, the really critical part about that connection now, I mean, thinking about it myself, it's Sri Vaishnavism. So the Ramanuja and the development of Sri Vaishnavism basically is a modality by which the old Tamil bhakti of the Alvars is given like that Sanskritized kind of overlay. And that connection is like what Raya is tapping into at that time. So, and again, you know, when I say like Kannada king, Telugu this, and Tamil this, again, Kannada didn't mean Karnataka like the way we think about it today. Kannada just meant the South in many ways. You know, Telugu, yes, it did have a clear linguistic identity that was different than Kannada Bhasha. But, you know, so we have to think of all of these things in less reified terms than we think of them today. So I guess to summarize, what I'm saying is that he had a unique perspective to bring to the Telugu literary tradition, or to, you know, whatever South Indian literature or Indian literature writ large, in the sense that he was integrating all of these different strands. And I think that's what makes him such an exciting character, is he can draw. I mean, he wrote Sanskrit stuff, so he knew the Sanskrit literature. He knew the Tamil. I mean, you clearly see that he must have had some training in that. He knew the Sri Vaishnava stuff, hardcore, the theological doctrinal stuff. And he had this poetic sensibility. And he had this, like, lived life as a king, because there's that whole section when he has his Rajaniti section. So he's bringing all of this together. It's like this amazingly composite text. And whatever that identity was, as a non-Brahmin, non-Kshatriya, doing all this stuff, that's what he kind of contributed, and that's what he represents. And so if we can't put him into a category, which I don't think we can, then I think he also, represents how many other people and, dynasties or movements or whatever represent that kind of like categorical kind of identification, which again is indicative of this very exciting time when things were really shifting around and moving, and new people were coming in, new ideas coming in. So it's just an exciting time of like a lot of dynamic change.
Which perhaps explains why so many dynasties and kingdoms later fall back on Krishnadevaraya, either as a means of legitimization or cultural appropriation even sometimes. And I wonder how much Telugu's sort of trans-regional appeal, because you find it, even the Marathas eventually picking it up in Tanjavur and patronizing Telugu literature, comes from Raya's time, because I think he does at one point have one of the gods, I think it's Vishnu, basically affirming that Telugu is, his the divine language, or it's the one preferred by the gods and so on. And
well, no, that's not what he says.
Okay,
and this is yeah, it's okay. I'll explain this, because this is a critical line. It's a very famous verse. It first appears in the Kridabhiramam in a different context. It appears in the Amuktamayada in the voice of this Andhra Mahavishnu, and what he says is Deshabashalandu Telugu Lessa, which means of all the regional languages, Telugu is the best. So this becomes like a big, well-quoted line. The critical line is the line before it, though, and this is important. And it's not about divinity or gods or anything. It's actually something very laukika, very down to earth, and in my assessment, very political. And what he says, the previous line to that is, Yella Norupula Kolovan Yeragave Basari Deshabashalandu Telugu Lessa. So, which means once all the kings or the lords had gathered in the Sabha, Kolu, and Basari, and you spoke with all of them, Eragave, didn't you, figure out, didn't you realize that Telugu was going to be the best language for you? Means it's the most politically efficient language to use, because that's the language of your main lords. And so this is a very important point that I want to make, because it's not about literature, it's not about language identity, it's about political expediency. It's about what is the best language for you to use as the administrative language and to give some support to, because your lords are the ones that you need to kind of like get on your side. And if they're Telugu speaking, then you need to like also use Telugu. That's and this is what Andhra Mahavishnu says to him in a dream.
So it's also part of his very pragmatic ideas of kingship, right? Because that's another, he has these prescriptions he sort of gives out later in the poem. And they're actually quite fascinating, because at one point he says, man your forts with Brahmins, as opposed to these feudal lords. And it's almost like, you see this in the British time, right? You have all these Deshastha Brahmins the company picks up as their bureaucrats who are loyal to them, and sort of sends them in all around the princely states. It feels a little similar to that. He's trying to cultivate a bureaucracy rather than a nobility that might threaten the emperor's power, the king's power.
Exactly.
and there's all kinds of Arthashastra type prescriptions in it. And it's really interesting because you at one point you refer to him as this model of the Kavi Raja. So there is that kind of aesthetic element to it, but there's also this very strong pragmatic element. And there is, of course, his many years as a conqueror. And because one of the things I noticed when I was initially reading the book is at one point it felt like a sequence of battles, and I thought, my God, what is this man doing? What is this one battle and then the next battle and the next battle, year after year after year? One moment chopping off, or he claims to chop off the Adil Shah's head. Next moment he's in Bijapur. Then he's consecrating the Bahmani emperor and styling himself as this. Tell us a little bit about this conquest side as well, the political history as well, because I think we've taken up a good amount of time talking about his more intellectual pursuits, but I'm also very curious about the man on the ground, leading armies and doing the hard stuff, as it were.
So there's a lot. Just quickly on two things that you mentioned that are very important. This policy of putting Brahmins in fort commander positions is exactly like you said. It was a way to curb, lords who would rise up, because the Brahmins would they're not fighters. They just like want to keep things nice. They want to be, well taken care of. And that's what he did. He had those guys take those commandership positions. Of course, at the same time, we have to realize that Brahmins were also not just people who did text. I mean, Timarasu is a Brahmin, and he was like the most able minister. His sons were like able warriors on the battlefield. So even those, identities are getting complex. So that's one thing. And it's a very interesting policy. The other thing is, and I think I say this in the book, but maybe in the thesis, I don't know, but the Arthashastra, definitely you can trace certain verses of his Rajaniti to the Arthashastra, but a lot of them you can't. A lot of them have to do with the Portuguese very directly, for example, and very specific 16th century things. And so what we're seeing, like the literature, like everything, is the old stuff is there, but it's being kind of updated for, this modern period that, he's dealing with. So in terms of his battles, well, as you had to fight battles. That was the main thing that a king had to do. And he did. He was, like you said, it was just a continual succession of battles. But again, what people forget is the largest battle, the largest campaign, 6 years, the most hard-fought battles of his life were against the Gajapati. And what's critical about the Gajapati battle in that sense also was that was him trying to reclaim what was traditionally the Vijayanagara, land, which is everything south of the Krishna. So although the sultans were primarily, north of the Krishna, except that very important Tungabhadra Krishna Doab, which, it was a site of many battles, fundamentally, they were just like northern enemies that, you had to deal with incursions from time to time. But the Gajapati and reclaiming that whole coastal side of Andhra, that was the main thing. He needed to reclaim what was rightfully Vijayanagara. And that took up a lot of time. The other thing is, we also have to remember that, for example, that campaign, which took so many years, siege warfare, it's a long, drawn out thing. So you're not really fighting a lot of that time. You're just sitting there waiting to starve out people. And it's a game of patience, really. There were, of course, instances when there were attacks and that those are important too. But a lot of this warfare was strategizing and waiting and, positioning yourself and then kind of that critical moment to strike. But otherwise, he was kind of always on some kind of campaign. And after the Gajapati, then he came back. There was a period of some calm, you could say, at Vijayanagara. Maybe perhaps when he started writing Almuktamayada, I guess. I'm guessing probably. Although I have a feeling he was writing on the road also. I think of him oftentimes of how Caesar, wrote his great campaigns of Gaul. I don't know if you've read those. Amazing. If you read Caesar, I had this great Latin teacher, so I used to read this And he would be talking about all sorts of things, the people, the culture, and then a whole description of this military strategy he had. And he was writing this all while he was doing this on campaign, because there's a lot of free time actually for the king. So I do think he was undefeated in battle. He fought a lot of battles, but I think we also have to remember that there was a lot of space there too. And then later on, towards the end, we don't know anything about really the end, like the last 5 years or so. There's no good evidence of what was going on. My guess is that things were relatively calm. This is probably when the sultans were, gathering forces and just brewing with anger after this, terrible incident. So yeah, he fought a lot, as any king should and does and has to. That's their dharma, I guess.
And there's hints towards the end of the book. I mean, of course, you make this point that we don't know enough about that period, but you also cite these hints of some kind of hubris, some kind of arrogance sort of coming in, and that seems to affect him. Then the other thing is succession issues. He lacks an heir who's an adult, and I think partly because he came to power in an unorthodox circumstance, because there was a king with only minors as his heirs. He was in a similar situation now, and then of course you have the rise of his son-in-law Raya, who ultimately fights the famous so-called Battle of Talikota in 1565, and that's the end of Vijayanagara. But I mean, this hubris isn't all that surprising at all. It sort of makes sense that if you've been such a successful conqueror, if you've been this, while you've been kinging on one side, you've also been creating these literary works. You've got your Anubhava Mandap, I think that's what it was called, where you've got your poets and your, all kinds of wonderful people.
Bhuvana Vijayam.
Sorry,
Bhuvana
yes.
Vijayam.
There you go. Yeah.
The Hall of Victory.
The Hall of Victory.
Which is important. Again, see, the place of literature, the place of culture was called Bhuvana Vijayam, a hall of victory. And there's a relationship between cultural production and political power that is so important to keep in mind, Sorry to interrupt, but...
No, it makes sense. I got the name wrong. I don't know where the Anubhava Mandapam came from. I think that's another dynasty. It's just all muddled up in my head. Okay, I think we've got only about 10 minutes for audience questions now. So
okay,
if
sure.
you can start sending them in, I'll ask you those questions. Just, one final thing while we're waiting for the audience questions, I do want to ask you a little more about this whole, the successor states, building so much on Krishnadevaraya. Of course, they were closer in time to him, so perhaps they did not need literary proof and any kind of other support or extraneous influence to sort of pick him up as a hero and sort of build from there. But it's interesting that there is, for a man who's been used by so many dynasties as a source of inspiration and legitimacy, the lack of material is a bit, surprising. And that's the other thing, in your book, the way you somehow managed to pull together the slender evidence, let's say, other than his writing, and sort of, construct this real human being. And, from the Portuguese accounts, show you this slightly stocky man with his pox marks and so on, to the Tirupati inscriptions and the bronzes that he's put there as his official sort of representation in the temple. All of this is, it's a little puzzling that there isn't enough about him. Where is the material?
Well, I think this goes to the heart of one of the great issues, and we can have another whole discussion about this, just open discussion, because we have to think about what history means in India and what memory means in India. It does not mean what it means in the West.
Yeah.
It does not mean writing books. It does not mean, creating statues. It does not mean all of those things. Those things can happen. But in India, history, to me, the way I feel it is it's oral. It's the memory of an image. It's something that's passed down as a feeling through story. And that's what it is. And that's what these guys were doing. I mean, Nayakas and these guys and Tanjavur and everybody, they're all just like reviving and adding to the myth all the time. And that's who he is. That we don't need anything else. If you're in that world, who he is. Yeah. I mean, you grow up in Andhra. I mean, you just know that Krishnadevaraya is the greatest, and you hear all these stories about him and this and that. But which is very different than like hearing about his pockmarked face and, signs of smallpox and all that, or whatever other things that we'd pull from other historical sources. So that is what I wanted to try to do in the book, is give some legitimacy to those stories, those legends. Because in typical history, or in typical Western historical methodologies, those things are not allowed at all. I mean, I think you remember the review that came out. Yeah.
I do, yes.
Yeah.
And I thought it was a bit odd, because you do clarify in the book that this is the
I do.
and therefore I found it surprising that caused an issue, because you've clarified your approach to this material, which I thought was very interesting. Because in India, you're right, a lot of the material we have you can't quite wrap your head around it using those techniques that have been honed in Western academia, at least. And then, so you're right, there is there's a constant reimagining that's happening throughout time, and each of those imaginings is unique, and it's all fascinating. Okay, we've got our audience questions.
Okay, go for it.
The first one says, did you begin with any preconceived notions before starting the text, given your previous work? How does one begin with a fresh start with a text like this? I think this is the reference to your translation.
Of Amukta Malyada?
Yes. I mean, it doesn't mention, but yeah.
So wait, I didn't quite get the question.
Did you begin with any preconceived notions before starting the project, given that you'd already worked on the text? I think that's what the meaning is.
Okay. No. I think at least with Amukta Malyada, I just tried to approach it just as a literary work. And the main thing with me is I read the commentaries. And if you read any literature in India, I mean, of course, you read the verses, obviously, but the critical thing in Indian literature, at least with classical texts, is you have to read the commentarial literature. And there are layers of commentary. So there's the older commentators, there's the medieval type commentators, there's the colonial commentators, and then there's the modern commentators. And you have to go through all of those layers of, and again, that it's also a type of reimagining of the text, recontextualizing of the text. And so by doing that, I tried to take all of that into account and translate the verse as genuinely as I could, but then of course also try to add my poetic sensibility, because it is a poem. That's the other thing. Translating poetry is different.
So essentially, going through the history of the text itself, and as it's been perceived and reimagined by different generations, which is interesting, because there's a question here saying, did you use any other empire as a comparative basis when writing on Vijayanagara? It seems you just took different views of the emperor's text instead of comparing it with another political entity. Please.
No, I don't think I did specifically. I mean, I tried to understand what was going on in the other empires around. Like, what was the Portuguese Empire thinking about empire and about movement? What were the Deccanese sultans thinking about, their position? What was the Gajapati thinking about this stuff? What were the Tamil lords feeling? So I tried to do that a little bit, but no, I didn't go deep into another empire per se. I will say this though, I did do like deep reading of other biographies of great kings, like that, like Marcus Aurelius and Alexander the Great. Like those are really inspirational to me, to like read their stories and see how other biographers had constructed their lives from sometimes rather scanty sources and sometimes quite good sources. Yeah.
Okay. Arun asks, to what extent did lineage matter, and what made other rulers accept rule of the Raya? I mean, this again goes back to that question that we assume that lineage somehow was some kind of key legitimizing instrument, whereas perhaps it wasn't. And, we just think it was.
Right. That's exactly. I mean, it was important. There's no doubt about it. It's not to say that it wasn't important. And in fact, the way you can see that it's so important is the fact that he has to always kind of be legitimized by the Brahmin, like court, not the poets exactly, but there was all these poet type people that would like sing praises, like Prashasti type singers. You know, those guys were essential. You know, like Krishnadevaraya descended from the lunar lineage, blah 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 blah, all this stuff. You know, and the poets do it too in their writing. But you know, constantly needing that buttressing by the Brahmanic community was important, because obviously this was an issue, and you find this all over India, north, south, east, west, everywhere. The kind of legitimizing lineage creation almost, and grafting of lineages onto, you know, these great lineages happens all the time. Bards and poets are critical in this, because you know, bards and poets, that's like the media of the time. Those are the guys that are like sending the message out, you know. So that level of legitimization was important and was affected by these guys.
And you see that in Rajputana. The bards made me remember Rajputana, where, for example, you have a king who's died in battle, or supposed to have died, but then somehow the bard says, no, he escaped to this mountain where in a cave he was, you know, he sort of recuperated, and then he had a child, and the child sort of emerges from the mountain to reclaim the patrimony. And it's an interesting thing, you know, because you don't really know where the child came from, whether he's actually just claiming the previous ruler's bloodline or not.
Totally.
And that's the other thing point you make in the book, right? Even where you talk about religion affecting politics, you say it was one of several things that affected political decisions, not the overwhelming sort of force behind all political decisions, which I thought was very nicely made, without again lapsing into sermonizing, while also making the point quite well. Okay, I need to ask, what were the negative aspects of Krishnadevaraya that you discovered while writing Raya, and how did you deal with this?
So the biggest negatives, I kind of discussed at the end of his life, and that was, and we kind of touched upon it, this growing kind of megalomania. I mean, he really turned into a very arrogant and brash person at the end. The whole kiss my foot incident that was not very dharmic, and it was not nice. And I really do believe that things like that are what laid the seeds for, the fall, soon after, or whatever, 30, 40 years later. So I think that was a big one. And then again, we don't have like firm evidence of all this, but the Portuguese chronicles mention it, and it's definitely part of the oral tradition in the region. And that is he blinded his most trusted advisor, his father, the Timurasu, who he called Appaji, the guy that basically raised him like a father. And, in his kind of delusional, ideas of grandeur and all, he was just confused, I think, at that time. He quickly believed that this man that he loved was the one that was behind the poisoning of his infant son. And he has his most beloved person blinded, along with his sons too, the Timurasu's sons. So
it's interesting because I think you also speak about how he was unwell, or at least there's talk that he was unwell in these years. So you can almost sort of connect the dots there, right? Like, he's unwell, he's probably afraid that he's losing his grasp on power, and therefore everybody becomes an enemy. And sort of, you see a lot of examples in history like this. You see a lot of characters, even in today's world, for example, you can think of people who do get into a crisis, and then they see enemies everywhere, no matter where they look.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay, one question. Nihal asks you, what books inspired your journey as a writer and translator? I think the translator bit, you already referred to the biographies that you read, but the translator bit would be interesting to know.
I'll tell you, the person that inspired me the most, still inspires me, is A.K. Ramanujan. He's my number one and if you really look at the history of translation of South Asian literature, of Indian literature, it was pretty bad for a long time. Very stilted, very Victorian, didn't get a sense of the poetry of things, until you had A.K. Ramanujan. And he really, it was an important moment in the history of South Asian translations into English. His work, like those two books, I still teach those two books. I love those two books. If you want great work, read Hymns for the Drowning and Speaking of Shiva by A.K. Ramanujan. They're fantastic works, really amazing.
Will you ever go back to translating anything anytime soon?
Yeah, I would love to do that. But as you know, being an author is not so easy, and writing translations are really tough because you put in a lot of time, and then you get no academic credit for them. You get poor sales, and I hate to say it this way, but when you're trying to make your life, it's hard as an art. And then sitar, these are the things I do. These are things that people, they value so much in their mind, but our culture doesn't really support people that do those kinds of things, and it's really sad. But yeah, one day, hopefully, I would like to get back. I mean, my dream, and I've always wanted to do this, is to do, speaking of why we have such, I mean, even today in class, if I teach my Indian lit class, it's always a challenge to go and find good translations. So I would love to do like an anthology of classical Indian lit one day, but we can tell one of our rich Indian multimillionaires to support us to do that.
All right, we've got 2 minutes to close. So just one last question, which is, what inspiration can leaders today take from Krishnadevaraya? And I'll just say, if you can just, in like a 3 or 4 line thing, if you were to sort of represent Krishnadevaraya to somebody who knows nothing about him, how would you sort of present this person in a historically sound way, a succinct sort of, condensed way? How would you what do you see Krishnadevaraya as?
I see Krishnadevaraya as a strong and powerful king with clear sense of, that Kshatriya might behind him, but fully balancing that with an intellectual and philosophical view of what governance and what society and what culture should be. And if you don't have both of those in alignment, I think that's when we run into problems. You can't have a king who's just philosophical and lackadaisical and writing poetry and doesn't get stuff done. At the same time, you can't have a guy that's just out there blowing things up, willy-nilly. You need to have a balance of that wisdom and compassion. And I think that's what he represents to me, or at least that's the great story that I draw from his life. And I hope, leaders in our modern world will also draw on those things.
And you also make him wonderfully human, with his not entirely happy marriage with the Orissa princess and, other personal challenges as well. It really humanizes him in an interesting way. So you have a great king, you have a man, and you have the philosopher and thinker. So it's a well-rounded package. Okay,
Thank
with
you.
that, I think time is up. I've got
all right.
So enjoy, back to you. And thank you, Srinivas. This was wonderful.
Thank you, Manu. That was awesome.
Thanks.
Thank you so much, Manu. Thank you so much, Srinivas. And as you said, translating is hard work and our culture doesn't support it. We have started a new series at JLF Brave New World called Words Are Bridges, where we're focusing on translation and trying to see if we can build that. So just hang in there. I mean, what you have really done is an incredible piece of work, bringing Krishnadevaraya with all his, well, lack of a better word, pockmarks and everything alive, and for us to see. And that's truly important and change the narrative somewhat. Manu Pillai, Srinivas, Reddy, thank you both so much for this very interesting and exciting conversation. Thank you all for watching. Sorry we couldn't take all the questions as usual, but please do log back for our next session to commemorate the Indian Navy Day, Operation X, the war that changed the Indian subcontinent. Sandeep Unithan and Commodore A.W. Chaudhary from Bangladesh in conversation with Commodore Shrikant K. Snoor from the Indian Navy, with opening remarks by His Excellency Vikram Doraiswamy, the High Commissioner of India to Bangladesh. This will be at 8:30 p.m. Indian Standard Time and 3 p.m. Greenwich Median Time. See you soon.